Every year, Americans eat 50 billion hamburgers. That's roughly 150 burgers per person. Men, women, children, vegetarians included. It means the average American sits down, or more likely drives through, and eats 3 hamburgers every single week. And globally, over 100 billion hamburgers are consumed each year across every continent on Earth. Right now, as you watch this, McDonald's is selling approximately 75 burgers every second worldwide. But here is what almost nobody talks about. No one knows who actually invented it. There is no patent. There is no single room where it happened. In 1904, when the hamburger made its grand debut in front of millions of people at the World's Fair in St. Louis, it already had at least 3 men from different states claiming to be its father. All 3 had witnesses. All 3 had stories, convincing enough that historians are still arguing today. This is the story of a simple beef patty between 2 pieces of bread, a food that began on the back of a warhorse on the Mongolian steppe, crossed Russia in the hands of sailors, rode the waves of the Atlantic Ocean with German immigrants fleeing revolution, got nearly destroyed by a single book, was rescued by a man with a genius for white tiles, and then conquered the entire planet under the banner of golden arches. This is the history of the hamburger, and it is stranger, older, and more interesting than you ever imagined. Ancient Rome, the first hint. Some food historians push the story of ground and formed meat all the way back to the Roman Empire. Ancient Roman cookbooks describe a dish of minced meat mixed with pine nuts, pepper, and wine, shaped, formed, and eaten as a single serving. Call it a proto-patty. It's a stretch to connect it directly to the hamburger as we know it, but the underlying idea that you could take a tough cut of meat, grind it down, shape it, and make it edible is thousands of years old. The impulse to transform meat through grinding predates every civilization we know. What changes, over millennia, is the context. Who is doing the grinding, and why, and where they're going next. The Mongolian steppe, war food. The story that most historians find genuinely compelling begins not in a kitchen, but on the move. In the 13th century, the Mongol Empire under Genghis Khan was the largest contiguous land empire in human history. At its peak, it stretched from the Pacific coast of China to the doorstep of Western Europe. That kind of conquest required an army that never stopped moving. Genghis Khan's cavalry could cover extraordinary distances in a single day, distances that would have been logistically impossible if the soldiers had to stop, set up camp, build fires, and cook meals. The solution was brutal in its simplicity. Soldiers took scraps of raw meat, often beef or horse, and tucked them under their saddles before riding. Over hours of hard galloping, the pressure of the rider's weight and the heat from the horse's body would, according to historical accounts, pound the meat flat and tenderize it enough to eat. They ate it raw. No fire, no salt, no seasoning, no cooking. Just meat that had been softened by war. When Genghis Khan's grandson, Kublai Khan, led Mongol forces into Russia, his soldiers carried this preparation in their saddlebags. Russian cooks encountered the technique and began to refine it, off the saddle and into the kitchen. They added eggs to bind the meat, onions and spices to give it flavor. Slowly, the raw war ration of Central Asian cavalry became something closer to what we'd recognize as a formed beef dish, a precursor to what the French would eventually call steak tartare, named for the Tatar warriors who first developed it. From the battlefield to the banquet table. That is how food evolves. Hamburg, Germany. The name gets its address now. Trace that preparation west. By the 14th century, trade ships were regularly traveling between the ports of northern Europe and Russia. Evidence suggests that German sailors and merchants operating out of Hamburg brought back this Russian preparation of salted, minced, and sometimes lightly smoked beef. Dense, preserved, ideal for long sea voyages. In Hamburg's port neighborhoods, home to thousands of dock workers and laborers, it became practical, everyday food. The preparation picked up its location as its name. By the early 19th century, it was being called Hamburg steak, and the Oxford English Dictionary would define it as a hard slab of salted minced beef, often slightly smoked, mixed with onions and breadcrumbs. Notice what is missing from that description. There is no bread. There is no bun. There is no sandwich of any kind. Hamburg steak was eaten on a plate with a fork, as a legitimate meal, not fast food, not street food, an actual sit-down dish, respected enough to appear on restaurant menus. It traveled from Mongolia to Russia to Germany without ever being called a hamburger. It needed one more voyage to become that. The 1848 Revolution and the Great German Migration. Here is where the story crosses the Atlantic. In 1848, a wave of political revolutions swept through the 39 states of the German Confederation. Working people and liberal reformers rose up demanding constitutional government, press freedom, and national unity. The revolutions failed. Conservative forces suppressed the uprisings, and the men and women who had fought for change faced repression, imprisonment, or worse. Hundreds of thousands of Germans made a choice: leave. Between 1848 and 1860, more than 1 million Germans emigrated to the United States, one of the largest waves of European immigration the young country had ever seen. They settled in New York, Chicago, Milwaukee, Cincinnati, and across the Midwest. They brought with them their language, their music, their beer culture, and their food. Among that food was Hamburg steak. In American cities with large German immigrant communities, restaurants began offering the dish. And here, something interesting happened. Hamburg steak, which had been ordinary workers' food in Germany, became, in America, a luxury item. Because Hamburg was internationally known as a source of high-quality beef, the very name Hamburg steak carried a connotation of quality. American restaurant menus in the mid-19th century listed it as one of their most expensive offerings. People ate it on plates, with cutlery. As a proper dinner, the factory clock, and the need for speed. The Industrial Revolution was about to change that completely. By the 1870s and 1880s, America's industrial cities were running at a pace that had no historical precedent. Factories operated on fixed shifts. Workers clocked in and clocked out. Lunch was not an hour of leisure. It was 15 minutes, maybe 30, and you ate whatever you could grab before the foreman's whistle. Hamburg steak was still a sit-down meal. You needed a plate, a knife, a fork, a table, and time. None of those things were available on a factory floor. The next time you eat a burger in your car, remember, that's exactly why it exists. The solution, whoever first thought of it, was obvious in retrospect. Take the Hamburg steak, put it between two pieces of bread. Now you have something a worker can hold in one hand, eat in 6 bites, and finish before the whistle blows. The name of the culinary innovator who first made that sandwich has been lost to history. What matters is that the idea emerged from economic necessity, the way most great ideas do, not from inspiration in a moment of leisure, but from the pressure of not having enough time. The hamburger sandwich existed. Now it needed someone to claim it. In the 1880s, at least 3 different people, in 3 different states, with no knowledge of each other, independently developed what we would recognize as the modern hamburger sandwich and served it to paying customers. Each story has some evidence, some witnesses, and some gaps. And the reason this argument has lasted 140 years is simple. All of them are plausible. Let's examine each case. Claimant 1, Hamburger Charlie Negreen, Seymour, Wisconsin, 1885. In the summer of 1885, a 15-year-old boy named Charles Negreen set up a food stand at the Outagamie County Fair in Seymour, Wisconsin. He was selling meatballs, beef, formed into round balls and fried. It seemed like a reasonable idea. People at fairs eat food. There was one problem. Meatballs are round. Round things roll. And a round ball of meat in your hand, while you're walking through a crowded fair, looking at exhibits, talking to people, it's messy, impractical, and almost certainly going to end up on your shirt. Business was terrible. People walked past his stand without stopping. Then Charlie Negreen did something different. He took a meatball, pressed it flat between his hands, and laid it between 2 slices of bread. He sold it to a customer who was walking. The customer could hold it. The customer didn't need a plate. The customer kept walking and eating at the same time. The concept worked. The business recovered, and Charles Negreen returned to the Outagamie County Fair every single year to sell hamburgers for the rest of his life, 66 consecutive years, until his death in 1951. He became known throughout Wisconsin as Hamburger Charlie. Today, Seymour, Wisconsin is home to the Hamburger Hall of Fame. In 2007, the Wisconsin State Legislature officially declared Seymour the home of the hamburger. Charlie's claim rests on 6 decades of public sales at the same location and the institutional backing of his home state. What it lacks is any written record from 1885 itself. Claimant 2. The Menches Brothers, Hamburg, New York, 1885. The same summer, a different fair. Brothers Frank and Charles Menches were professional food vendors from Stark County, Ohio, men who made their living traveling a circuit of fairs and carnivals, selling food to crowds. Their signature item was a pork sausage sandwich. At the Erie County Fair near Buffalo, New York, held in a town called Hamburg, which gave it the informal name the Hamburg Fair, the Menches brothers ran into a problem. It was an unusually hot day in late summer. Their pork supplier, a local butcher named Andrew Klein, was reluctant to slaughter more pigs in extreme heat. He had no more pork to sell them. What he did have was ground beef. The Menches brothers took it. They cooked it up. Their verdict: dry, bland, not good enough to sell. So they started experimenting. They added coffee, yes, coffee, along with brown sugar and a combination of other spices they had on hand. They cooked it again. Better, much better actually. They served it on bread with ketchup and thin sliced onions. Customers tried it. Customers liked it. Now, what to call it? According to family legend, Frank Menches looked up from the food stand, saw a banner hanging across the fairground that read, Hamburg Fair, and said, "This is the Hamburger," named for a town in New York, not Germany, not the port city of Hamburg, a small town in Erie County that happened to share its name with a famous German city. In Frank Menches' obituary, published in the Los Angeles Times in 1951, he was formally acknowledged as the inventor of the hamburger. The Menches family still operates a restaurant in Akron, Ohio today. They also claim, with slightly less historical support, to have invented the ice cream cone and the concept that became Cracker Jacks. They were a creative family. Their claim has the advantage of specificity: a named location, a named butcher, a named moment of christening. What it lacks, like Negreen's account, is contemporary documentation. Claimant 3, Fletcher Old Dave Davis, Athens, Texas, late 1880s. The third claimant operated in a different style entirely. Fletcher Davis, known to locals as Old Dave, ran a lunch counter in Athens, Texas, in the late 1880s. He made no grand announcement of invention, filed no papers, gave no interviews to newspapers. He simply made food and sold it. According to oral histories collected decades later, Davis served a fried ground beef patty with mustard and Bermuda onion between 2 slices of Texas toast, thick-cut butter-toasted white bread, with a pickle on the side. The story goes that the idea came from practical necessity. A customer was in too much of a hurry to sit down for a proper meal, so Davis wrapped the steak and bread together and handed it over the counter. In 1904, Fletcher Davis and his wife City traveled to the St. Louis World's Fair, where they ran a sandwich stand. A Texas journalist named Frank X. Tolbert later documented the story. During the 1980s, the Dairy Queen ice cream chain funded a documentary about Davis's claim. Davis never sought fame from it. He never tried to franchise, trademark, or even formally name what he was selling. He just made it and sold it, year after year, in a small Texas town, until the world eventually came to him at a World's Fair. A fourth claimant, Oscar Weber Bilby, Tulsa, Oklahoma, 1891. Just when you think 3 is enough, Oklahoma enters the conversation. On July 4, 1891, a rancher named Oscar Weber Bilby built an iron grill on his property near Bowden, Oklahoma. He shaped freshly ground Angus beef into round patties, grilled them over fire until juicy, and served them on his wife's homemade yeast buns, actual buns, not just 2 flat slices of bread, alongside freshly churned ice cream and hand-mixed root beer. This is the critical distinction the Bilby family makes. Oscar Weber Bilby was the first person to serve a ground beef patty on an actual hamburger bun. On April 13, 1995, Governor Frank Keating of Oklahoma proclaimed, following what the proclamation called meticulous research, that the first true hamburger on a bun was created and consumed in Tulsa in 1891. He declared Tulsa the real birthplace of the hamburger, the verdict that never came, and what it actually tells us: 4 claimants, 4 states, no written document from the moment of invention in any case, no photograph, no menu, no receipt. Here is the thing: this is not unusual. The telephone was independently invented by Alexander Graham Bell and Elisha Gray within hours of each other. The steam engine emerged from multiple engineers working in parallel across Europe. The airplane was practically reinvented by the Wright brothers and Alberto Santos Dumont at the same time on different continents. Great inventions don't often spring from a single mind in a single room. They rise when the conditions make them inevitable. When enough people face the same problem at the same moment, the solution appears in multiple places simultaneously. The hamburger was no different. Factory workers needed portable food. County fairs created hungry crowds with no tables. Ground beef was cheap and widely available. The answer, flat patty, 2 pieces of bread, was so obvious that multiple people found it independently within a decade. No single winner. But that question, who was first, mattered enough that it followed the hamburger all the way to the World's Fair. And at the World's Fair, something happened that made the argument irrelevant. The World's Fair, the Louisiana Purchase Exposition, opened in St. Louis, Missouri, in April of 1904. It was, at that time, the largest World's Fair in American history, an event designed to celebrate the centennial of the Louisiana Purchase and to showcase the United States as a modern industrial power. Over 7 months, more than 20 million people passed through its gates. The 1904 St. Louis World's Fair was a place where Americans encountered things they had never tasted before. Iced tea was popularized here. Before this moment, most Americans drank tea hot. The waffle ice cream cone was invented here, or at least dramatically popularized, when an ice cream vendor ran out of paper cups and borrowed waffles from a neighboring stand. Cotton candy was demonstrated. Peanut butter was promoted. Dr. Pepper was marketed to a national audience, and somewhere in the sprawling fairgrounds, people were eating hamburgers. The hamburger at the 1904 World's Fair was not a revelation to everyone. It had been quietly sold in Texas, Wisconsin, Ohio, and New York for 2 decades. But this was its moment of mass introduction. Farmers from Kansas standing next to merchants from New York, standing next to factory workers from Detroit, all of them reaching for the same thing: a beef patty on bread, hot, fast, held in one hand, eaten while walking. The fair created, in a single season, a shared national experience around a food that had previously existed only in regional pockets. After St. Louis, the hamburger was no longer a regional oddity. It was an American food. Think about what you ate the last time you were at a county fair, a stadium, a street festival. The food you grabbed with one hand while doing something else. The hamburger invented that category. Then, 2 years later, someone nearly destroyed it entirely. Upton Sinclair and the Jungle, 1906. In 1906, a journalist named Upton Sinclair published a book called The Jungle. Sinclair had spent weeks working undercover in the meatpacking plants of Chicago's stockyards, and what he found there was horrifying. The book described in detail what happened inside the industrial meat processing facilities of the early 20th century. Diseased animals processed alongside healthy ones, meat scraps swept off filthy floors and ground into products for sale, workers so exhausted and rushed that basic sanitation was impossible, rats in the processing rooms, preservatives used to disguise rotten product. The grinding machines that turned beef into hamburger patties were a particular focus, because ground beef was uniquely easy to adulterate. You could stretch it, fill it, hide almost anything in it, and the consumer would never know. Sinclair wrote The Jungle, intending to draw public attention to the exploitation of immigrant workers. He wanted people to be outraged on behalf of the workers. "I aimed at the public's heart," he said later, famously, "and by accident, I hit it in the stomach." The American public was not, primarily, outraged on behalf of the workers. They were outraged, genuinely, viscerally, nationally outraged, about what was in their meat. Within weeks of the book's publication, beef sales across the country collapsed. Congress passed the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Federal Meat Inspection Act the same year. Landmark legislation, significant progress. But the cultural damage to ground beef was not so quickly repaired by legislation. The hamburger, which had just made its grand public introduction at the World's Fair 2 years earlier, was suddenly the symbol of everything wrong with industrial food. The next time you feel skeptical about where your food comes from, that instinct has a name, and it is 120 years old. It was called street meat, the food of the desperate, something no self-respecting person would put in their mouth. A decade in the shadows, through the 1910s, hamburgers existed at the margins, sold by street vendors with no fixed address, in carts with no visible kitchen, for people who had no alternative. No reputable restaurant would serve them. No middle-class housewife would bring ground beef home from the butcher. The timing was particularly cruel. The hamburger had just been introduced to millions of Americans at the highest-profile food event in national history. It was perfectly positioned for a moment of national adoption, and then a single, extraordinarily well-written book set it back 20 years. What it needed was not better regulations, though those helped. What it needed was someone who understood that the hamburger's problem was not sanitation. It was perception, and perception could be engineered. Wichita, Kansas, 1921. A cook and a salesman, Walter Anderson, had been cooking in Wichita since 1916, operating out of a converted streetcar. He had developed, through trial and error, a specific technique for cooking beef patties. Take a portion of fresh ground beef, press it flat into a thin square shape, poke 5 holes through the surface of the meat, not 4, not 6, 5, so that heat from the griddle could rise through the patty, and cook it from both sides simultaneously without needing to be flipped. Fast, consistent, every patty the same. In 1921, Anderson met Edgar Billy Ingram, a man who could sell anything to anyone and had the restless energy of someone who had been waiting his whole life for the right product to put behind him. They opened White Castle in Wichita, a tiny restaurant, 5 stools, a counter, 5-cent hamburgers. The price was not the challenge. The challenge was the decade of cultural wreckage that Upton Sinclair had left behind. Every potential customer who walked past the door carried a mental association between ground beef and the jungle. Ingram understood that he wasn't launching a restaurant. He was launching a rehabilitation campaign for an entire category of food. The architecture of trust. The first and most decisive move was visual. Ingram made everything white. The walls, white. The countertops, gleaming white tile. The uniforms, white and pressed. The exterior of the building, white painted steel, with battlements like a small castle. The kitchen was not hidden behind a wall. It was completely open, visible to anyone sitting at the counter. You could watch every step of the hamburger being made. The beef was ground on premises. The grill was in plain view. There was nothing to conceal, because there was nothing concealed. To reach middle-class housewives, the women who controlled household food budgets and who were still most resistant to ground beef, Ingram created a fictional character for newspaper advertisements, Julia Joyce, a home economist who appeared regularly in local papers to reassure readers that White Castle's food was prepared under strict sanitary conditions. Julia Joyce did not exist, but her endorsements were written to sound exactly like the kind of reassurance a skeptical housewife in 1921 needed to hear. Ingram went even further. He arranged for uniformed White Castle couriers to deliver bags of hamburgers directly to civic club meetings, hospitals, and high society functions. The message: this is not street food. This is food that belongs in respectable places, among respectable people. If you see it at the hospital board meeting, it must be fine. The strategy worked with a completeness that bordered on the remarkable. The numbers that ended the debate. By the mid-1920s, White Castle was opening a new location every few months: Omaha, Kansas City, St. Louis. By the end of the decade, even trend-setting urban consumers were eating there. By 1937, White Castle was selling nearly double what it had sold in 1930. Through the depths of the Great Depression, through years when Americans had almost no discretionary income, White Castle was growing. That year, the president of the National Restaurant Association publicly declared that the hamburger was as American as apple pie and coffee. In 1961, White Castle became the first restaurant chain in history to sell 1 billion hamburgers. McDonald's passed the same milestone 2 years later, in 1963. Time magazine, in 2014, named the original White Castle slider the most influential burger of all time. In second place was McDonald's. But while White Castle had won the cultural battle, had genuinely restored the hamburger's reputation, and built a nation of burger eaters, it had not yet built a nation of burger chains. That required a different kind of ambition. It required someone who looked at a simple restaurant in California and saw not a meal, but a system. San Bernardino, 1948, the speedy service system. Dick and Mac McDonald had been in the restaurant business since 1940, running a drive-in in San Bernardino, California. It was a conventional operation: car hops, a broad menu, all the standard elements of an American roadside restaurant. Profitable, but unremarkable. In 1948, they made a decision that seemed, from the outside, slightly insane. They closed the restaurant for 3 months. They fired the car hops. They eliminated almost the entire menu. When they reopened, they were selling 9 items: hamburgers, cheeseburgers, soft drinks, milk, coffee, potato chips, and pie. Hamburgers cost 15 cents. There were no waiters, no plates, no silverware. Everything was served in paper wrapping and paper cups. You walked to the counter. You ordered. You received your food almost immediately. They called their operating method the speedy service system, modeled deliberately on factory assembly line logic. Every station had one function. Every employee performed one task and one task only. The person who put the ketchup on the bun did not also put the pickle on the bun. Specialization, repetition, speed. Hamburgers were cooked ahead of time, wrapped, and kept under heat lamps. The moment a customer ordered, the burger was already done. This was not how restaurants worked. This was how factories worked, translated into a kitchen. The McDonald brothers began a modest franchise program, eventually selling 10 franchises, but they were by temperament cautious men. They were not trying to build an empire. Then, in 1954, a milkshake machine salesman drove to San Bernardino to figure out why a single restaurant needed 8 multi-mixer machines at the same time. Ray Kroc, the man who saw the system. Ray Kroc was 52 years old in 1954, and his career had been, by his own later admission, a long series of near misses. He had sold paper cups. He had sold real estate in Florida. He had sold milkshake machines across the Midwest. He was not a wealthy man by the standards of mid-century American ambition, but he had, after decades of selling things to people, developed an instinct for recognizing a system that worked, the kind of operational efficiency that could be replicated, franchised, scaled, and sustained across enormous distances. When he walked into the McDonald brothers' San Bernardino restaurant and watched the operation for the first time, he later said it felt like a religious experience. He saw workers moving like parts of a machine. He saw standardization so complete that the quality of the food was independent of who happened to be working that shift. He saw the future. He became the McDonald brothers' national franchising agent. On April 15, 1955, Kroc opened his own first McDonald's franchise in Des Plaines, Illinois, with red and white tile visible from the road, and 2 golden arches rising from either side of the roof that were visible from a significant distance. It was designed to be seen. By the time Kroc purchased the McDonald brothers' complete equity in the business in 1961 for $2.7 million, a transaction that included a handshake deal for ongoing royalties that Kroc never honored, Annual sales had reached $37 million across 228 restaurants. When Kroc died in 1984, there were more than 7,500 McDonald's restaurants worldwide. The franchise machine and the real estate genius. What Kroc understood that the McDonald brothers did not was that the money was not primarily in selling hamburgers. The money was in controlling the land. Kroc established a system through which McDonald's Corporation purchased the real estate for each franchise location, then leased it back to the franchisee. The franchisee paid monthly rent, or a percentage of sales, whichever was higher. This meant that even if a franchise was struggling with its hamburger margins, McDonald's Corporation was still collecting rent. It also meant that if a franchisee failed to maintain standards, Kroc simply declined to renew the lease. The lever of control was the lease. The lease was always McDonald's. This real estate architecture made McDonald's Corporation one of the most profitable businesses in American history. It is, in a very real sense, a real estate company that happens to sell hamburgers. Every time you drive past those golden arches, you are looking at a land deal as much as a restaurant. Hamburgers, World War II and the Cold War II. The international expansion of hamburger culture was not purely a commercial story. It was also a story of geopolitics. During World War II, millions of American service members were stationed across Europe, the Pacific, and North Africa. For the populations of Britain, France, Germany, and Japan, who encountered American soldiers and their food culture, the hamburger became associated with something beyond just calories. It became associated with America itself, with the prosperity and power that America seemed to represent. The hamburger traveled as soft power before the phrase soft power existed. When McDonald's began its international expansion in 1967, first into Canada, then across Europe and Asia through the 1970s and 1980s, it was moving into markets that had already been primed by decades of that cultural presence. The most symbolic moment in the hamburger's global journey came on January 31, 1990. A McDonald's opened on Pushkin Square in Moscow, the first American fast food restaurant in the Soviet Union. The line to get in stretched for blocks. Over 30,000 people were served on the first day. Soviet citizens who had waited hours in line reported that they were not entirely sure what a hamburger was supposed to taste like, but that they had come because it felt important to be there. The Berlin Wall had fallen 3 months earlier. The Cold War was ending, and on one of the most famous public squares in the Soviet capital, people were eating hamburgers. Whatever political science textbooks say about that moment, there is an argument to be made that the hamburger was there at the finish line, and that 30,000 people in Moscow understood it. But the hamburger's story wasn't over. In fact, it was about to get more complicated than anyone had anticipated. The competitors and the burger war's McDonald's success inevitably attracted competition, and the competition drove the hamburger into progressively more sophisticated forms. Burger King opened in 1954. Its signature product, the Whopper, introduced in 1957, was positioned as a larger, more substantial burger than the standard McDonald's offering, a deliberate challenge. Wendy's opened in 1969 in Columbus, Ohio. Its innovation was the fresh, never-frozen beef patty, square in shape, extending beyond the edges of the circular bun, and cooked to order rather than held under a heat lamp. The square patty was not merely aesthetic, it was a statement. We are not cutting corners. The corners of the beef go beyond the bread, so you can see them. Transparency as product design. The Big Mac, introduced by McDonald's in 1968, invented by franchise operator Jim Delegati in Pittsburgh, added a third piece of bun, a second patty, and a proprietary sauce that became one of the most recognizable tastes in the world. The Big Mac Index, introduced by The Economist magazine in 1986, used the price of a Big Mac in different countries as a tongue-in-cheek way to compare purchasing power across currencies. A hamburger had become a unit of global economic measurement, a food that learns to speak every language. What kept the hamburger alive across more than a century and more than 100 countries was not rigidity, it was adaptability. The hamburger, at its structural core, is one of the most flexible food formats ever devised. protein, bread, condiments, vegetation. Every element is replaceable. In India, where the Hindu prohibition on beef consumption is culturally central, McDonald's developed the Makaloo Tikki, a spiced potato patty burger, and the McSpicy Paneer. The entire Indian McDonald's menu was redesigned around the structural format of the hamburger, with the beef entirely removed. In Malaysia and Indonesia, all McDonald's locations operate under halal certification. In Japan, the teriyaki burger, a beef or chicken patty glazed with sweet soy sauce and served with mayonnaise, became one of the most popular menu items in the country's history. In France, where farmers famously drove tractors to block the construction of a McDonald's in 1999 as a protest against American cultural imperialism, McDonald's responded over the following decades by making its French operations among the most locally sourced in the entire global system. The hamburger didn't conquer the world by staying the same. It conquered the world by becoming, in each place it arrived, a slightly different version of itself. That is not a marketing strategy. That is evolution. The gourmet burger revolution, and what it means for you. But McDonald's dominance created its own backlash. And that backlash made burgers better. Five Guys, founded in 1986 in Arlington, Virginia, built its entire brand identity around a few uncompromising commitments: fresh beef, never frozen, peanut oil for the fries, an open kitchen where you could watch every step. Five Guys expanded slowly, but with intense loyalty, eventually reaching markets across the United States and internationally. Shake Shack began as a hot dog cart in Madison Square Park in New York City in 2004. The permanent kiosk that replaced it became one of the most talked-about food spots in Manhattan. The burger, a smash-style patty on a proprietary potato bun with a proprietary sauce, was positioned as something genuinely different from fast food. Thoughtful sourcing, quality ingredients, design-conscious environment. Shake Shack went public in 2015 and now has locations in over 40 countries. At the absolute top end of the market, haute cuisine chefs began to engage with the hamburger as a serious culinary form. The French chef Daniel Boulud, when asked by a reporter to comment on French farmers' protests against McDonald's expansion, created his own response in the form of a burger, a high-grade sirloin patty stuffed with red wine braised short rib and foie gras, topped with Parmesan, truffle, and tomato confit, served on a brioche-style potato bun. The dish launched at his restaurant DB Bistro Moderne for $29 and remains on his menus worldwide today. The point is this: somewhere between the 5-cent White Castle slider of 1921 and the $40 foie gras burger of 2004, the hamburger stopped being just a food. It became a canvas, and that canvas is now facing the biggest challenge in its 700-year history. The challenge of the 21st century: producing 1 pound of grain-fed beef requires approximately 1,800 gallons of water. A single quarter-pound hamburger patty generates roughly 6.5 pounds of greenhouse gas emissions during production, accounting for land clearing, feed production, methane from cattle, transportation, and processing. The global beef industry is one of the largest single contributors to agricultural carbon emissions worldwide. 100 billion hamburgers per year carries a cost that goes beyond culture and business, and the food technology world's response has been to ask a question that would have seemed science fiction 50 years ago. What if the burger didn't need the cow? In 2016, Impossible Foods launched the Impossible Burger, a plant-based patty that used a compound called heme, derived from the roots of soy plants and produced through fermentation, to replicate the taste and texture of beef with remarkable accuracy. Beyond Meat followed with its own formulation. Both ended up in fast food chains, in Burger King under the name Impossible Whopper, in McDonald's test markets in Canada and Europe. The most radical development came earlier. On August 5, 2013, in a laboratory at Maastricht University in the Netherlands, the world's first hamburger grown from bovine muscle cells outside a living animal was cooked and eaten. The project had cost $300,000 and taken years of research. It was led by scientist Mark Post and funded by Sergey Brin, the co-founder of Google. The burger was described by the two tasters present as something close to beef. though leaner, and slightly missing the fat that gives beef its depth of flavor. The hamburger, which had begun as meat tenderized under a saddle by a galloping horse, was now being grown in a petri dish. The same problem, how do you make beef portable, affordable, and satisfying at scale, is still being solved. It just looks different now. What the hamburger actually is, the hamburger was not invented. It was evolved, from the raw meat tucked under Mongol saddles on the 13th century steppe, to the kitchens of medieval Russia, to the port neighborhoods of Hamburg, to the restaurants of New York and Chicago, where German immigrants served it on plates as a luxury item, to the county fairs of Wisconsin and New York, and the lunch counters of Texas, where anonymous people pressed it flat and put it between bread because there was no time to sit down. No single person made the hamburger. Thousands of people made it, incrementally, across 700 years, solving the same fundamental problem in slightly different ways. The same way the telephone, the steam engine, and the airplane were all simultaneously discovered by people who had never met. The hamburger emerged because the conditions made it inevitable. Not one genius, one pressure. Factory workers who needed to eat standing up. And the same answer, arrived at independently, in Wisconsin, in New York, in Texas, in Oklahoma, within the span of a decade. But if the hamburger's invention is diffuse and contested, its cultural meaning is not. It is a map of migration. The Hamburg steak that arrived in American cities in the 1850s was carried there by people forced out of their homes by political failure. It was their food, adapted to new conditions, eventually transformed into something entirely different, and then exported back to the world. Almost every significant American food has a version of this story. The hamburger's version is the most dramatic. It is a mirror of economics. Every time the hamburger changed form, it was responding to economic pressure. Factory workers needed to eat fast. The patty went between bread. The Great Depression made White Castle's 5-cent slider a lifeline. The post-World War II suburban boom created the conditions for McDonald's drive-through model. The 21st century's environmental reckoning is creating the conditions for the lab-grown patty. The hamburger has always cost approximately what people can afford, and it has always taken exactly as long to eat as people have time for, and it is a tool of empires. McDonald's did not expand globally by accident. It expanded with American military presence, with American trade policy, with American cultural soft power, and with the franchise model that Ray Kroc perfected. When McDonald's opened on Pushkin Square in 1990, it was serving as a symbol of something far larger than itself. 30,000 people understood that, and it is, in the end, just a very good sandwich. The combination of salted, seasoned ground beef, still warm from the grill, with some char on the outside, against soft bread, with acidity from ketchup or pickles cutting through the fat, with the crunch of raw onion or lettuce against the softness of the patty, is one of the most satisfying combinations of flavors and textures that exists in the human culinary tradition. People have been discovering this and rediscovering it for over 100 years. The number that puts it all in perspective, 50 billion per year, in America alone. That is the number of times per year that someone, somewhere in the United States, solves the same problem that a Mongol cavalry soldier solved on the steppe in the 13th century. I need to eat something satisfying, I need it quickly, and I need to be able to keep moving when I'm done. 700 years of history. 4 claiming inventors. 1 book that almost destroyed it. 1 man in white tile who saved it. 1 milkshake salesman who scaled it beyond all imagination. 1 square in Moscow, where 30,000 people stood in line to taste what the end of the Cold War felt like. All of it, compressed into something you can hold in one hand. The next time you pick one up, whether it's a $5 drive-through burger or a $40 restaurant creation, take 1 second before you bite into it. You're holding about 7 centuries of human ingenuity, migration, economic desperation, marketing genius, geopolitical symbolism, and culinary ambition. Then, eat it. It's better warm. If you made it this far, through 7 centuries of beef, bread, and history, we'd genuinely love to know what you think. The question that food historians have been unable to settle for 140 years: Who actually invented the hamburger? Was it Charlie Negreen in Wisconsin, the Menches brothers in New York, Old Dave Davis in Texas, or Oscar Bilby in Oklahoma? Drop your verdict in the comments below. We'll read every one. And if you found this story worth your time, the kind of history that hides inside the things you thought were ordinary, subscribe to this channel. Every week, we go looking for the stories behind the things that seem too familiar to have stories. They always do. We'll see you in the next one.